We must move quickly. The Romans are watching.
In the year 6 AD, one census sparked a rebellion that would echo through history. Thousands died. An entire province was shaken. And this moment would plant seeds of conflict that lasted for generations. But it all started with a simple question. How much tax do you owe Rome? This is the story of how a regional power struggle became a turning point for the entire ancient world. For over 60 years, Judea had lived under a peculiar arrangement. King Herod the Great ruled the land, but Rome held the leash. When Herod died in 04 BC, his kingdom fractured like broken pottery. His sons squabbled over the pieces, each claiming legitimacy, each proving incompetent. Rome watched from the sidelines, unimpressed. The wealthy merchants wanted stability. The peasants wanted freedom. The priests wanted religious autonomy. No one could agree on anything except one uncomfortable truth. Rome's patience was running thin. Augustus Caesar, the supreme ruler of Rome, decided the experiment with puppet kings had failed. Herod's sons were weak. Judea was becoming destabilized. Constant feuding between the royal family members created chaos that threatened Rome's interests and tax revenues. Something had to change. The decision was made in Rome's corridors of power, away from the eyes of Judean citizens. Judea would become a direct Roman province. No more king. No more pretense of independence. Rome would rule directly through a Roman governor, collecting taxes and maintaining order with the full force of the military. This wasn't unusual for Rome. They had done this countless times across their empire. But for Judea, it was a seismic shift. The people had grown accustomed to having at least the appearance of a Jewish ruler. Now, a foreign administrator would command them. In 6 AD, a new governor named Quirinius arrived with a specific mission: conduct a census. This wasn't just about counting people. A census meant registration, which meant taxation. Every person, every house, every piece of property would be cataloged and evaluated. The empire needed to know what resources Judea could provide. This meant extracting more wealth than ever before. The Census of Quirinius was unlike anything Judea had experienced before. Previous taxation under the Herod dynasty had been variable, based on negotiations and local understanding. But Roman taxation was systematic, merciless, and impersonal. Roman administrators didn't care about your family history or your religious obligations. They cared about numbers and revenue. The census teams arrived in towns and villages across Judea, armed with scrolls and mathematical precision. They counted not just people, but livestock, crops, property, and possessions. Everything had a value. Everything could be taxed. For a largely agricultural society living on modest margins, this was catastrophic. A farmer who owned 10 acres suddenly found himself owing taxes he couldn't afford. Families that had managed their finances carefully for decades now faced bankruptcy. The psychological impact was equally significant. The census represented total loss of privacy and autonomy. The Romans literally owned your information now. They knew where you lived, what you owned, and how much you were worth. For a people with a strong religious tradition, emphasizing that only God should know their souls and count their worth, this was a violation of their most fundamental beliefs. Jewish religious law explicitly discouraged census-taking. The Torah contained stories of plagues and punishments that resulted from counting people. Census-taking was seen as arrogant, as humans presuming authority that belonged only to God. Conservative Jewish leaders had resisted census practices for generations, but Quirinius wasn't asking for permission. He was imposing Roman law and Roman order. The people had two choices: comply or rebel. Wealthy elites, particularly the priestly class who maintained good relations with Rome, advised compliance. They understood Roman power and Roman ruthlessness. Resistance would be crushed, but not everyone agreed. In the countryside, among the poorer classes and the more religiously conservative populations, anger festered. Some believed that cooperating with the census was a betrayal of God's law. Others simply couldn't afford the taxes that would result. Whispers of resistance became louder conversations. Small groups began discussing whether armed rebellion was justified. The tension was palpable across the entire province. From the fires of this discontent emerged a new movement that would fundamentally shape Jewish history for the next 70 years. A man named Judas of Galilee, sometimes called Judas the Galilean, stepped forward as a leader of resistance. Judas wasn't interested in negotiation or compromise. He preached a radical ideology. Judea should be free, and armed rebellion was the path to that freedom. Judas gathered followers, primarily from Galilee, a region known for independence-minded thinking and agricultural resistance to Roman authority. He organized what amounted to the first armed Jewish insurgency against Rome. His movement, which would later be classified by Roman historians as the Zealot movement, rejected the legitimacy of Roman rule and refused to pay taxes to Caesar. Instead, they proclaimed that only God was king of Judea. This wasn't merely political rebellion cloaked in religious language. It was genuine theological conviction combined with political resistance. Judas taught that submission to Rome was inherently sinful, that accepting Roman authority violated the covenant between God and Israel. His followers believed they were fighting a holy war, not merely a tax revolt. The rebellion spread quickly across rural areas. Young men, inspired by Judas's words and attracted to the promise of freedom and divine support, joined his forces. They conducted raids on Roman supply lines, attacked the local tax collectors, and organized alternative governance structures in regions they controlled. Roman response was swift and brutal. Quirinius sent soldiers to crush the rebellion. The fighting was intense but unequal. Rome had professional soldiers, military discipline, and the full resources of an empire. Judas had passionate volunteers with agricultural backgrounds. The result was tragic. Judas was killed, many of his followers were executed, and the immediate rebellion was suppressed. However, the movement didn't die with Judas. It transformed and evolved. His ideology became embedded in Jewish culture. His followers dispersed across Judea, carrying the message that armed resistance to Rome was both justified and necessary. The memory of Judas became legend. Mothers told their children about the man who refused to bow to Rome. Rabbis debated the theological implications of his teachings. Over the following decades, new zealot leaders would arise, all tracing their spiritual lineage back to Judas of Galilee. The rebellion of 6 AD wasn't just a tax revolt. It was the beginning of a movement that would eventually lead to catastrophic war with Rome. The Judea of the decades following 6 AD became increasingly unstable. The census and the Zealot rebellion left deep wounds on the social fabric. Trust between the people and Rome evaporated. Resentment between collaborators and resistors tore apart Jewish communities. Wealthy merchants and priests who cooperated with Rome were seen as traitors by many common people. Poor farmers and rural populations felt abandoned by a religious establishment that seemed more concerned with maintaining good relations with Rome than defending Jewish interests. The Roman response to ongoing instability was predictable. More troops, more surveillance, more taxes. As resistance increased, Rome extracted more resources to pay for security. This created a vicious cycle. More taxes generated more resentment. More resentment generated more resistance. More resistance generated more Roman military responses. The Jewish high priest and the Sanhedrin, the religious and legal governing body of Judea, found themselves in an impossible position. Rome held ultimate authority, but they needed to maintain legitimacy with a population that increasingly rejected both Rome and anyone who cooperated with it. Different factions within Judaism developed different approaches to the Roman occupation. Some, called Sadducees, believed in accommodation and cooperation. They represented the wealthy, the priestly establishment, and those with economic ties to Roman stability. Others, particularly the Pharisees, sought to maintain Jewish religious and cultural identity while technically complying with Roman law. They believed that as long as Jewish religious practice remained pure and unchanged, spiritual independence could be maintained even under political subjugation. The Zealots, meanwhile, grew in number and influence. Their message was simple and powerful. Armed resistance is the only path to freedom. As poverty increased, as Roman exactions grew more severe, and as military repression became more violent, the Zealot ideology attracted more followers. Young men in particular saw military action as preferable to the hopelessness of subjugation. By the middle of the 1st century, Judea was a tinderbox. Multiple armed groups operated in rural areas. Urban centers bristled with tension. Rome responded with military governors who were often brutal and insensitive to Jewish religious and cultural concerns. Each military governor seemed more callous than the last, more willing to use violence to enforce compliance. The transition to direct Roman provincial rule in 6 AD had devastating economic consequences that rippled through every level of Judean society. Under the Herod dynasty, taxation had been burdensome but somewhat flexible and locally understood. A tax collector from Galilee knew his community, understood which families could pay more and which could pay less. There was a human element to the system, however unjust it was overall. Roman taxation was different. It was systematic, merciless, and designed to extract maximum revenue regardless of local economic conditions. Roman tax assessors arrived with mathematical formulas and bureaucratic precision. They didn't care if a farmer had experienced crop failures or if a family had suffered illnesses that prevented work. The taxes were due, calculated according to Roman algorithms, and enforcement was guaranteed. The standard Roman provincial tax was typically around 20% of all agricultural produce, plus additional taxes on property, animals, and commercial transactions. For a region where most people lived on subsistence margins, these rates were unsustainable. Families that had worked the same land for generations suddenly found themselves unable to afford the taxes on that land. Many peasants were forced to sell their property to wealthy landowners or to Roman investors. This accelerated the concentration of wealth in the hands of an elite minority. Small family farms consolidated into large estates, often worked by wage laborers or tenant farmers in conditions approaching serfdom. Poverty increased dramatically across rural Judea. Hunger became more common. The gap between rich and poor widened significantly. Urban centers like Jerusalem became overcrowded as displaced rural populations migrated to cities seeking work. This created slums and unemployment. It also created a population that was desperate and willing to support radical political movements. The Jerusalem elite benefited from Roman rule and the increased trade and commercial opportunities it brought. But the vast majority of Judeans experienced direct Roman rule as economic catastrophe. The middle class of skilled craftspeople, small merchants, and independent farmers shrunk. The population increasingly divided between a small wealthy elite and a large impoverished majority. This economic polarization had profound political consequences. It fed the Zealot movement. It generated revolutionary ideology. It created an environment where violent resistance seemed like the only possible response to intolerable conditions. Religious teachers and rabbis began incorporating themes of economic justice into their teachings. The wealthy were denounced in moral and theological terms. Prophecies about divine judgment on the oppressors were repeated and remembered. Direct Roman rule didn't just change Judea's politics and economy. It triggered a profound spiritual crisis that would reshape Judaism itself. For the first time in Jewish history, the temple in Jerusalem had no independent Jewish king to oversee it. The high priest remained, but he served at Roman pleasure. The Sanhedrin could make certain decisions, but Rome held veto power. Jewish religious autonomy was compromised in fundamental ways. Roman governors sometimes appointed high priests based on political considerations rather than religious qualifications. Some governors were openly contemptuous of Jewish religious practices. They stationed soldiers in and around the temple. They demanded tribute from temple revenues. Some governors even took temple treasures to pay for military operations or administrative costs. For deeply religious Jews, this was unbearable. The temple was the holiest place in Judaism, the earthly dwelling place of God's presence. Romans treating it as just another resource to extract wealth from was not merely political injustice. It was spiritual violation. This crisis forced Jewish thinkers and religious leaders to develop new theological responses to foreign domination. If God was truly powerful, why had he allowed the temple to come under Roman control? Where was God's protection? Some rabbis developed the concept that maybe this was temporary, a punishment for communal sin, and that repentance would restore independence. Others began emphasizing internal spiritual aspects of Judaism that Rome couldn't touch. Prayer, study, and moral behavior became emphasized as ways to maintain spiritual freedom even under political subjugation. Still others, like the Zealots, argued that God would reward armed resistance, that a holy war against Rome was not just permitted, but required by religious law. The Dead Sea Scrolls written during this period reveal deep anxiety about the present age and intense apocalyptic expectations. Many Jews believed that God was about to intervene decisively in history, would overthrow Rome, and would restore an independent Jewish kingdom. This apocalyptic thinking became increasingly prominent. Prophets and would-be messiahs began emerging, each claiming to have received divine revelation that liberation was imminent. Some organized armed bands expecting divine intervention. Others preached moral transformation as the prerequisite for divine salvation. The period of 6 AD onwards saw an explosion of Jewish religious creativity and diversity. The very crisis that threatened Jewish identity and independence forced Jews to reimagine what Judaism meant. Could you be truly Jewish under Roman rule? What did fidelity to God mean? What did covenant and law mean in the context of political powerlessness? These weren't abstract theological questions. They were existential questions that Jews were asking in their daily lives, in their homes, in their synagogues. The Census of Quirinius and the direct Roman rule that followed created consequences that extended far beyond 06 AD. The seeds planted in that year would bear bitter fruit for generations. The Zealot movement, born from the resistance to the census, didn't disappear. It transformed, evolved, and grew. Over the next 60 years, wave after wave of Zealot leaders would arise. Some focused on banditry and attacks on Roman officials. Others organized larger-scale armed resistance. The movement became increasingly sophisticated, increasingly organized, and increasingly willing to employ violence against both Romans and those who cooperated with Rome. The tension between these radical resistors and the Jewish establishment that preferred accommodation would create civil conflict within Judea itself. Different factions of Judaism became not just theologically distinct, but politically hostile to each other. By the middle of the 1st century, Judea was deeply fractured. Multiple armed groups operated with different goals and ideologies. Rome maintained control through military force and cooperation with Jewish elites, but the underlying instability never went away. The Jewish War, which erupted in 66 AD, was directly descended from the dynamics set in motion in 6 AD. The immediate triggers for that catastrophic conflict were different, but the underlying issues were identical. Roman exploitation, Jewish resentment, radical resistance movements, and the impossibility of peaceful coexistence. When the Jewish War finally broke out, it became one of the most destructive conflicts of the Roman era. The Romans utterly devastated Judea, destroyed the temple, and killed hundreds of thousands. The Jewish state ceased to exist. For nearly 2,000 years afterward, Jews would be scattered and stateless. The Census of Quirinius was forgotten by most people. Few remember the name Quirinius, but the consequences of what he initiated resonate through history. Understanding how an ordinary administrative procedure could trigger such catastrophic consequences helps us understand how political systems collapse, how resentment transforms into violent revolution, and how the actions of distant bureaucrats can shake the world. The year 6 AD teaches us that history often pivots on moments we might overlook, that injustice accumulates and compounds, and that when people lose hope through peaceful means, they often turn to violence as their last option. This is the enduring legacy of that pivotal year when Rome took direct control of Judea.